Hello guys, this is James. Today we're gonna talk about Element UI. It is really a very good component library for the MVVM, the most popular one, Angular, React, and the Vue framework. And today we are trying to analyze what the methodology of them to design a specific component. It can be beneficial because in the future we might write our own component library, and then this can lead us to think better how to make our own library. And so today we just take the form that's this component, for instance, to think, because that's the one of the most complex one in the element UI. The functionality of the form is you have to really write something in the form, right? And then it can be validated and it will really notify, okay, if there's something wrong or not. So that's really the basic knowledge, and we have to see the codes here. Actually, it has sort of 3 tiers for each items in the form. It has AL form, and then a form item, and AL form input. So what exactly does the 3 tier do, and why they designed the 3 tiers? Okay, let me explain. L form, or the outermost wrapper, is one we really directly use our users components, right? So it will receive two things, the data and the rules, because those are the things defined by the users of this component element UI library, right? So it has to be really passed into the form. And the second thing about a form item is the one we think to have the validation warning code or the label of each form. So it's really something like a focus on the validation and the text. The innermost one, L input, deal with the input in the form or in the input box, and it will notify the L form item to have the validation of the content. So if it has passed the validation or it fails, something like that. So it's also important. To perceive it better, let me just make some illustration here. Alright, let's just record the structure in the element UI. The outer wrapper should be L form, right? And inside there's L form item, and also inside L input. And then the 3 components will all put in the users components. In the users components, what we're gonna define is the data and the rules. We have to use the rules to verify. The data here, we can really pass to the L form, and also the rules we pass to L form. The L form have the data passed to L input, because the input just have some functionality to monitor what has been input exactly in the box. And then it will really have feedback to the L form item. The L form item will receive the rules and verify depends on the rules. So that's kind of the basic logic of how the flow of the data or the communication between different components. Another thing important is like maybe someone will ask, okay, why we create some tier like this? Maybe it's just the 2 tiers, right? The first one is the L form. The second one is the L form item. The item will do the verification stuff, and the L form just receive the data and monitor the data. The users components will just communicate with L form, and L form will communicate with the L form items, right? So it gives the rules, and the L form item will give the verification result. Well, I think that's also something possible, but since the element UI already has set the 3 tiers, right, it's better we just always follow it. And another thing very important is the reusability. We just break down each single functionality to one component, so it can really contribute to the reuse of different components there. So in the future, we don't have to be the L form item. We need to have a kit like L input. It has something else, and still the L form item can verify. Talking about usability, there's another thing I have to note is that we cannot really in the L form item to import L input, or in the L form to import L form item, because it will really make a strong dependencies among the 3 different components. Then one individual component cannot be reused without the other ones. So in the code, we have to try some different ways to write it in lieu of the import, blah, blah, blah. Okay, let's get started to code. First, let's create a folder to put the form everything about the form components inside, and then let's create our m input. That's the innermost components, and we start from there. And in the innermost one, we just create the template first. And remember that the inner one, we just receive all the data we pass in, and also monitor it if there are any change events. And the value should receive from the parents. Of course, laterally we just use a property. We receive anything in the value property, and then of course we have to emit an event. So we create at input events. It means that every time we input, it will really call the function in the method, and then in the function we will emit the event to notify the view item, to verify, or even the upper tier, the parent component. Now we have to define a props, and the value should be really get from the parent's component. Now we just define the onInput method, because earlier we have set up the events. If we have the input at the input, we will really invoke this method. What we have really put here is emit events entitled input, and also the parameter should be the value. That's our contents we input there. So it should be e.target.value. Alright. Now we create another index.view. This file is the user components. We will try to use the components we created in this user components. Of course, here the main purpose is to define data and the rules. As we can imagine, if we really want to use the element UI libraries, of course we first create our own components and just include those form, input, everything in that component, right? That's the same thing we did it here. Now we just first import the m input and set up the components and also put it in the template. Here there's something very vital. We have to use a V model to pass the value, right? Because in the m input, we have used is to bind the value to the value, right? The attributes of input self. The second thing is to have an input method to emit something. As we can see that with V model exactly, it can really connect it to our m input components, pass the something to the value prop of m input. The second is receive the input events from the m input components and also assign the event target value to it. And here in the data, we have defined the data user information. That's we define the username and passport as our data. Then let's define our rules. We can just define some simple rules, like it has to be input the password, the username. If we don't input anything properly, it will show us the message. Of course, this is for the verification, right? Later we'll also pass it to the verification component. Now I think it's very clear that what we were writing in the V module, it should be passed the username, userinfo.username, and later we'll pass the userinfo.password. As for now seeing the result, let's go to the app.view to include the components index into it, and we have to also create components and add it in the template. Alright, in order to let it show something, let's put something in the username to say it. Well, yeah, it shows a form and also the input values, right? And in order to say if it's really works well, I mean the communication between two components well, we just output the username userinfo.username to say that if the value changed accordingly, and let's see, well, it's really changed well, because if we input something, also the result of value change, so it works well. That's for it. And now I think we should wrap it with the verification components. We called it mForm item, just like the F-form item in element UI. Here we have a point very important. We don't really explicitly define the m input as the components in the mForm item components. I hope you don't get confused. I mean that when we create our mForm item components .view, we really don't include the m input as its components there. Rather, we just wrap it in our index, that's the user components, to wrap it. But there's something we have to define. We have to really use slot. It gave the m input dot view a slot, so the content of it can really be displayed in our index.view. This is also a way to create a reusability in the futures. If we, since the m input has a slot there, we know that it can really wrap something. If nothing to be wrapped, of course the slot will not display anything. Now the test case also include the m form item in the index in our users component. Then we put other things inside. The first is label, so the label of the input box. We put all the verification and those text informations inside. Alright. Since the label will also be passed through the index.view, that's the user's component. That's why we have to really define it as a props too, so it can receive the data. Now we have to go to the index.view to pass something to it, and we just pass a string now, so it no need to use v_on. We just use label equals to a string. Let's use the username. Of course, we can also define the label to receive a value in the export data, but now we just define as a string. As we can see that, okay, the username really showed up here, so that's correct. The next very important logic is that this also components works as a verification sender, so it will send the verification information, right? So we have to really let it to display those informations. We can create something like an arrow and also use v_if. If there's arrow, then we have to display it, and if it doesn't have any, we'll just hide it. And also the arrow will depends totally on the verification functions also will define in this component. Since we'll display the error, we have to do is in the export default the data to return the error value, and by default we set it as a none. Before we proceed with the verification functions, let's just wrap everything with inform, because remember in the original elements UIs it also wrapped everything with a L form. So first we in the index .ui, the user components, we wrap it and we create a file named m form, and then we, since the m form really have things there, just remember we have to put slots there too, just like what we did in the m form item. And remember what we have to do here is to also pass the verification information, the rules, and also the models, that's the username and password inside. In succession, we also have to include it, import it in the index.view, that's the user's component. Now what we have to really concentrate is to pass what we have got in the m form to the m form input from the father component to the child components. Of course we can use prop to pass it, but here let's just try something different. We use provide and inject. As we know that provide can set at the parent component, and then it can communicate with the son, grandson, grandson, etc. Hence, a very convenient way to communicate with the m item and m put. Be aware, this is very important. We'll pass this here. So in the future, if we use form in m input or m import item or any child there, it will always refer to the instance of m form. In the m inform, we have to first to inject. Writing inject is just like writing props, so we can have a type. There's something we need to modify. With regard to the provide, we have to use the syntax like a return an object. So we will include this form in this object. Alright. Then we output form.rules to test. Let's check the result. Seems nothing showed here. It is because in the index views, what we have really passed is only the user info that will refers to our username password. But however, these rules, even though we defined in the m form a props, but we don't really pass anything. So let's just check. All right, it has the whole object, right? Username, password, the rules. Then the next thing what we have to do is copy this one. The label should be, and here I will let the input again. Later we can comment it, and let's see what happened here. All right, so then we just set some tiny things. For instance, placeholder. Here we can set, here we can write something like, and then later in the M input, we will not really define any props. So it will receive by the attributes of M input, and then we will check it out. Actually, if we check here in the DOM elements, we can see there's something wrong. We should use the placeholders here in the input, but it used up here. So in the div, the wrapper. So that's something wrong. We have to change it. There's a way to change it in M input. We don't want anything to show up here, but here we can use vbind. That's, it will just bind it to the input rather than the div. Just now both of them have the placeholder. Then we have to eliminate this placeholder, and then what I'm gonna do is here we just put something like this inherit. And after this, let's say it again. All right, this div doesn't have any placeholder, only the input box has. That's how we really fix the things. To fix placeholder, two step. First, we bind it to the input, the attributes. The second, we use inherited attributes false. Then we can really achieve what we want. All right. Well, I think we have finished the logic in the three or four components already. Now let's do the validation logic. Here, when we input something different, and then the input will have an input event. And here, right, event, we should emit from item view, this component. So in that component, you will do the validation. But here's the problem. We cannot emit to it. It doesn't really include any input tags here. So it doesn't come right. Even in the index.view, it's really the father of it. It's really the father of input. But here it doesn't have any input tags, and we cannot add anything because, as we said, those three components should be the individual components. One cannot depend on the other one. We should do something else. It's not the best way, but one way to solve it is to use this validate just refers to the event, and then in the form item we can use the on, right? Just like a on and mounted. Here we should always at this moment we will monitor this event, validate event. Then we should call a function should. So it means that when we receive the valid event, we'll call the function validator. So we have to define. The first thing we should do, the validator, of course, we should know the current value and the current rules. And the current value and current rules, since we have passed inject form inside, so it means that in the form we can get everything. So including user information we can get, right? Because we have set two boxes, and this one should get exactly these rules, and this one should get exactly these rules. How to distinguish them? Actually, it's very simple. In the index, we just create something here. This one, right? It should be exactly like this one. And the second is equals to, in the M input, no, in the M items, then we have to define this. Then we can really use this prompt to distinguish. After we get the rules and then the value, then we should do the validation. And here we don't write the logic of the validate. we will depend everything on a library, and here we just first exit and just install it. We use this one because also in the element UI they use this one. Install, and after the installation we can rename here to import, and so here in the method we can use it. First step is we have to define which one is the value and which is the rules. So we cannot use console log. Here I just equals to this one, right? And then equals to this one. Next, we have to pass something to the async. We should pass something descriptive, which one will and which rules it applies to it. So we will pass it an object, and I limited DESC. Now we create an instance of this schema and put the DESC inside. Now we can use the instance of schema to validate. What we should put inside is this prompt refers to which to validate, and value means the current value. So we will say that the current value is valid or not. The next thing, we have to define a callback function. In the callback function, we will decide what to do with the error here. We can say logic like this. If there's an error, we just output the error just to see the error 0.message. That's in the message we have already defined in our rules. And then if there's no error, we just make the error equals to none. So earlier we defined also what if, right? So the what if we already decide if the error will be should or not. Now we just do another run, and let's see what will happen. Well, it works fine. Now let's just remove some redundant elements. Still straight 2. That's something we have to eliminate. And then this button I think everything is here because earlier we just print out everything. All right, so it's something like this already. And let's try to do the verification. Input to username. If we don't input anything, it said please input your ID. Only in the color is not red, right? Done the simple verification. And also this one, right? If we don't put anything here, just tell us, okay, you should put password. The thing left is the global verification, because if we have the fill in everything, then we will together, all of them will have a verification here. So that's the logic we have to do. So we just modify this button a little bit. Rather than point, we just change it to login, and then yeah, we just we have to do is change the name of point to login. And the second thing, yeah, if we have read the element UI, we know that if we want to reference one component in the parents one, the child components in the parents one, we can also use the ladder way. Okay, that's another way to use all the method or all the data in the child M form components. Bring everything to the parent one, and just do something. So now we can really use it here by using login form. All right, the logic when do something like this. Since we have references, so in the dollar reference we can get. So in the dollar refs is array, so we should get. Now I just copy here login form. But if we have this, we can validate. So this is really cool. A validate function in M form. Here, there should be something like a validate function here, okay? Then we'll try to define a callback function. This callback function will receive the result from the async-validator, and then it will define if everything is valid, we just alert submit, and if it's not, then we output error. Now let's hop to our next task is to write the validator in the M form. Here the logic is only in the conditions that all pass the test, then it can really validate. Now just remind that the M form have two children now. The two M form items we defined in the index.views, and they both stored as arrays in the instance of unformed components. So we just write something like list dot dollar children, and here is a problem I have to remind it. Like earlier we write dollar parents, this create dependencies. That's not what we want, but then later we'll fix it maybe. Then what we're gonna do is the each children, I mean the two inform item. Of course, we will call the validate functions inside of it to together validate everything. And now the problem is that how we can get all the results, the validation, since of course some of the validation might happen in the servers, so it will take a long time. So how can we get everything together? Well, this critical problem has been solved by the package we include, the async-validate. It will return something like a promise. So we can really use a method in promise, very useful. Or it will really return true or false. Let's take a look back at in the index.view what we define the callback function. Because the logic here is if there's an error, okay, we just catch the error. And if it's no error, it doesn't return anything, right? So here, since the async validator will not really pass any parameters, so we can just use no parameters, then we return true to the callback function, and there is some errors, then it will catch, then that's it. Okay, I found the error here. Actually, it should return a value. If it doesn't return, then we cannot decide, right, the return value whether it's an error or not. So here, let's just try again. Right, error submit. Well, now it can see that it do the global validation correctly. Also in the global validate, I can so log the result of task, and we see that really it yield out promise. So it really returns promise. Alright, I think that's all for today's activity. Writing some parts of a components library. Writing a library or some parts of the library will almost consider the reusability is something of paramount of importance. So we have to break down different functionalities in different components, and to make sure that each component we will create will not depend on each other so much. So that's really satisfy the reusability. And second, we can really recall that in this example, we use a lot of tons of different ways to communicate. For instance, the most commonly used prompt and emit. Also, we use on and emit, right? And we put something in the reference, and then we use the $ref. Another thing is that we use provide and inject to have a deep communication. Also, we use slots. We use $children, $parents. So that's a tons of ways of communication. Second, don't forget that we have used a very important package, the async validator. The upside of it is it always return a promise. So in the future, of course, if we deal with something, not just the front end, something deal with the back end, we also can use it. And always remember, we really have to return a value. With the return value, we can decide if the promise is rejected or resolved. But still, there's something imperfect. Also, I have mentioned in the project. In the minput.view, we use something like $parents. Then in the mform.view, we use $children. These two things will create dependencies among the two components we create. That's not something we want. Using $children and $parents really cannot satisfy our requirement of reusabilities in the component library. Actually, I have read the source code of Element UI. They use a very neat way to fix it. And they just search from one kid to the parents, then to the parents of the parents, sort of something like that. I will cover this part in the next videos to eradicate those kind of dependencies. But in general, I think we did a very good job to break down the functionality and the rise of codes of the parts of the library. It seemed a little bit hard at first, but little by little we just accomplish it. So that's all for today, and thanks for watching. I will see you in the next